Have you ever wondered why we eat soul food? Well, today we're going to talk about the history of African Americans and soul food. And if you like stories like this, you can find more stories like this at onemikehistory.com. But without further ado, let's get started. Although fried chicken evolved independently across many different countries, fried chicken is a distinctly American invention. The origins of fried chicken can be traced back to enslaved Africans who brought together Scottish techniques of deep frying chicken with fat and seasoning techniques from Western African cooking. One of the earliest recipes of fried chicken came from the British cookbook in 1747 called The Art of Cookery, made plain and easy by Hannah Glass. The recipe, which was a hit in Britain and the colonies, particularly in the southern states, called for the butchering of pieces of chicken to be floured, then fried in lard. While there's not a lot of strong evidence that fried chicken is from Western Africa or it was invented then brought over in the transatlantic slave trade, West Africans did have a history of cooking chicken. They typically would use a method of braising their chicken. This is most likely the slave population that became linked to fried chicken because they were already familiar with cooking chicken and because the prevalence of poultry here in the United States. This is where the history of chicken takes a racist turn in the early 19th century. Fried chicken then became linked to Southern states, and Southerners started to link it to racist stereotypes connected to African Americans. They depicted them as poultry thieves and ravenous eaters of fried chicken. You start to see the popular stereotypes used in the connection of African Americans eating certain foods, reinforcing the idea that African Americans were not intellectual. Two of the most popular images used in terms of food was fried chicken and watermelon. Ironically, plenty of white people love these same foods, but for whatever reason, the idea and the negative stereotypes associating these foods with African Americans, and it still exists today. The irony of it is that before the 20th century, fried chicken was seen as a luxury item only eaten on special occasions. Although the recipe is extremely simple, not everyone has the right kitchen tools or the access to poultry to make it at home until dramatic improvements in poultry farming in the early 20th century. As the United States began to flex its military muscle at the beginning of the 20th century, Black GIs taught the world about delicacies of American barbecue, chitlins, and fried chicken. Motivated to settle overseas because of the enduring racism of the United States and the relative social acceptance of African Americans in other countries, many former servicemen opened up restaurants and shared their beloved recipes and turned regional soul food into a global phenomenon. The global spread of soul food really took off after the end of World War II. Recently discharged Black military veterans in the European theater stayed overseas and opened and operated restaurants. At first, they mainly cooked for African Americans who were on active duty, but these home-style meals also found patrons from an unexpected source: foreign foodies. Europe was not the only place where soul food thrived. African American veterans stayed behind to open restaurants in Asia. After serving in Korea and Vietnam, these countries became well known for soul food restaurants with a patronage of both African Americans and Native Asians. American soldiers were stationed in South Korea during the Korean War, introduced the concept of frying and battering chicken as a substitute for turkey on Thanksgiving. This was likely the first introduction of the food to the Korean people, who were primarily steaming chicken or eating it in stews. However, it would not be for decades after the end of the Korean War that American-style fried chicken took off in Korea. During the 60s, the first ever rotisserie chicken shop opened up in Korea, along with the invention of the yellow bag chicken. Salarymen would bring home yellow bag chicken, which was a whole rotisserie chicken in a bag, and give it to their families. At the time, chicken was still not widely consumed in Korea, thus the price was considerably expensive. Chicken became viewed as a luxury item that all families look forward to eating once in a while. The reputation and popularity began to skyrocket. It was this nostalgia that helped fuel the boom of the coming fried chicken movement. Then, two changes occurred during the 70s. Cheap cooking oil became widely available and fried chicken became more affordable. This made it possible for families to prepare their own fried chicken, season it, coating it in flour before dunking the entire bird in hot oil. Fried chicken then went mainstream in 1977 with the opening of Lem's Fried Chicken in the basement of Seoul's Sinsky department store. The owner of Lem's Fried Chicken had traveled to the United States in 1975 for university and saw how KFC sold its fried chicken in pieces. He began experimenting and creating his own ginseng chicken and selling his creation in a 6-piece set. Lem's Fried Chicken became the first fried chicken franchise in South Korea, and the appetite for the dish only grew larger as KFC entered the market in 1984. As of February of 2022, there were a staggering 87,000 Korean fried chicken joints in South Korea. In an ironic twist, the phenomenon has gone full circle as Korean fried chicken stores now open up restaurants here in the United States. Every year, America enjoys the traditional feast known as Thanksgiving, and during this time, pumpkin and sweet potato pies sales spike. But did you know the history behind these beloved desserts and their connection to Northern abolitionists, Thanksgiving, and the holiday season as a whole? See, Thanksgiving pumpkin pie was once the hotly contested battleground in America's cultural war. In the 1800s, pumpkins and sweet potatoes became a totem in the fight to abolish slavery in America. The introduction of sweet potatoes to Western Africa in the 16th century was a very slow process. Initially, root vegetables such as cassava and yams were preferred over sweet potatoes. However, after the transatlantic slave trade, which helped spread the popularity of sweet potatoes in Europe and the Americas, it was only then that the African American community started using sweet potatoes because of their convenience. Western Africa is a yam-based culture. While sweet potatoes are not the same thing as a tropical yam, enslaved people embraced them as a substitute in the absence of true yams. Before they had sweet potato pie, they had something called sweet potato pound, which is a corruption of the Native American word for baked bread. Enslaved people were eating roasted sweet potatoes cooked in the embers of fire and started spicing and mashing up sweet potatoes. As they got access to cooking technology and equipment like ovens, they started adding pie fillings, and the sweet potato pie was born. After slavery was abolished, African Americans began to migrate away from the southern United States in what was referred to as the Great Migration. During this time period, many African Americans brought along one of their favorite dishes, sweet potato pie, and it was introduced to other regions of the country. During the same time period, during the early 19th century, eating pumpkins and celebrating Thanksgiving became synonymous with identity politics. Abolitionist and pumpkin enthusiast and home economics pioneer Sarah Joseph Hale was the driving force behind the pro-Thanksgiving campaign. Hale campaigned for state-level Thanksgiving celebrations and was largely successful in the early 1800s, helping spur declarations for Thanksgiving in 29 states by 1850. But as the fight over slavery intensified and the Civil War loomed, people in the southern states began to reject what they saw as Northern cultural aggressions. The state of Virginia in particular wanted no part of Thanksgiving. In a letter to Hale, Virginia Governor Henry Wise, who was strongly pro-slavery, expressed his disapproval of New England abolitionist goals by referring to the theatrical national claptrap of Thanksgiving, which he said was used to encourage ministers to preach Christianity politics. Still, in 1863, Abraham Lincoln would declare the last Thursday in November as the National Day of Thanksgiving. Lincoln hoped that this holiday would serve in some way to heal the wounds of the nation and restore it. And since then, every president has kept that tradition alive. Still, some members of the Confederacy were unhappy with the Thanksgiving celebration and perceived it as a political move. They were especially unhappy with what they saw as a New Englander attempting to dictate how they should live. So for many years after the Civil War, Southerners refused to celebrate Thanksgiving and refused to eat pumpkin pie. It was not until after Reconstruction that Southern states began to accept Thanksgiving, and it wasn't until 1941 that Thanksgiving holiday was officially recognized into federal law. So, in the absence of pumpkin pie, Southerners started cooking sweet potato pie made by formerly enslaved people. Pumpkin pie, despite its popularity, remained a Yankee food for many generations. It didn't gain widespread recognition across the South until the 20th century when television and supermarkets began to promote mass-market pumpkin pie fillings. The stereotype of African Americans being excessively fond of watermelons came during a specific period in history and was used to fulfill a specific political purpose. After slaves won their emancipation, they made watermelon a symbol of their newfound freedom by growing, eating, and selling it. Southern whites responded by using the fruit to depict African Americans as unclean, lazy, and childishness. This trope was so widely accepted within popular culture that the origins of it are almost forgotten. The trope of the racist watermelon didn't emerge until after emancipation. In the early 1900s, the European imagination associated the typical watermelon eater with Italians or Arabs. A British officer stationed in Egypt in 1808 described the watermelon as a poor Arab feast, noting that the locals ate them ravenously as if the passers-by was going to snatch them away. Watermelon rinds were apparently a common sight on the streets of the port city of Rosetta. In Egypt, watermelon was also associated with uncleanliness, laziness, and childishness. These associations eventually made their way to America, but watermelon hadn't yet been connected to African Americans. In fact, at that time, Americans were just as likely to associate watermelons with white Kentucky hillbillies or New Hampshire yokels as they would a black South Carolina enslaved person. During chattel slavery, some plantation owners would allow their slaves to cultivate and even sell their own watermelons. Sometimes they would even give them a day off during the summer to enjoy their first watermelon harvest. Southern plantation owners viewed this slave's delight in watermelon as an indication of their own supposed compassion. Slaves were also careful to relish watermelon in a manner that followed the code of conduct established by whites. As a result, whites could expect slaves to act in a manner of a caricature of a watermelon-craving, juice-dripping pickaninny. Refusing to comply with this stereotype could jeopardize the precarious relationship between master and enslaved. The abolishment of enslavement drastically altered the relationship between black people and whites. Formerly enslaved individuals avoided sharecropping on white-owned plantations by growing, consuming, and selling their own watermelons. This behavior of enjoying your freedom and cultivating your own land and selling watermelon in public markets provoked a major fear within the white community. Newspapers would then stoke this fear that whites have and strengthen the idea of African Americans having an affinity for watermelons. In 1869, Frank Leslie's illustrated paper published a cartoon of an African American eating a watermelon. The accompanying article stated that Southern African Americans have a strong liking for watermelon. They thoroughly enjoy eating it. 2 years later, a Georgia newspaper reported the arrest of a black man for allegedly poisoning a watermelon with the intention of killing his neighbor. The article compared the man's actions to that of the Ku Klux Klan and asked if the Republican Congressional Subcommittee investigating the Klan should look into this incident in particular. The article also described the man as walking to the courthouse carrying an enormous watermelon. Medical journals also wrote with a scientific earnest about black patients. They claimed that their intestines were clogged with watermelons. In an 1888 report by Dr. D.Z. Holliday of Harlem, Georgia, describing how he broke down a bowel instruction of an African-American man. He claimed that the mass was filled with 820 seeds, all of which the man had ingested in one night. Also, during the 1880 election season, Democrats accused South Carolina state legislature, which was majority black during Reconstruction, of having wasted the taxpayers' money on watermelons for their own enjoyment. In 1915, the white supremacist film D.W. Griffith, A Birth of a Nation, included a watermelon feast as a depiction of the emancipation, as corrupt northern whites encouraged former enslaved people to stop working and enjoy watermelons instead. This idea of implicating black appetites and black character through the watermelon, with the primary message being that African Americans were not ready for their own freedom, and that stereotype of associating blacks with watermelon remains a common occurrence in the United States even today. For example, in 1947, when Jackie Robinson broke Major League Baseball's color barrier, he was confronted by race-baiting taunts, including crowds throwing garbage, tomatoes, and watermelon rinds at him. Even in 1989, blacks protesting the killing of a black boy in Bensonhurst, New York, were taunted by whites, some of them holding watermelons over their heads and screaming at them to go home. There are literally hundreds of instances over the years where the watermelon in association with African Americans being used as a tool of insult. Even decades after the end of the Jim Crow era, this cultural symbol of blacks and watermelon continues. Crow laws enforced a racial segregation in the American South from the 1890s to the 1960s. Named after Thomas Rice and his minstrel character, Jim Crow Rice, these laws were designed to maintain racial hierarchy, and the laws covered every aspect of Black life, from voting rights to public transportation, and were strategically designed to marginalize African Americans. The insidious impact of the system extended beyond legal restrictions, seeping into social norms and customs that enforced a rigid racial hierarchy. One particular instance of Jim Crow's absurdity was the claim that Black people were prohibited from eating vanilla ice cream except on Independence Day. While there is no direct evidence refuting or confirming this claim, that's because there was no laws or ordinances that expressly banned African Americans from consuming ice cream. This claim seems to have emerged from the societal arena, where riddled with prejudice and unspoken practices. To understand this concept, it's crucial to delve into the idea of Jim Crow laws and how they were formulated and implemented. Jim Crow came in two forms: laws and etiquette. Southern states instituted a rigid system of segregation laws that limited access to public facilities, businesses, transportation, and even leisure activities. But etiquette was unwritten rules that dictated how African Americans should perform in white society. This varied from person to person, but some common norms was not being allowed to handshake a white male or display any friendly gesture to a white woman, avoid eating with whites, and if by chance they found themselves eating together, whites were to be served first. For example, in the book Behind the Backlash, White Working Class Politics in Baltimore, 1940 to 1880 by Kenneth Dunn, Dunn mentions that segregated dining was the norm and asserted that Black people could not eat vanilla ice cream in the presence of white people except on July 4th, when everyone could eat anything. Another example is Maya Angelou's biography, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. Maya Angelou shares that people in her hometown believed that white people were so biased against Black people that they couldn't even buy vanilla ice cream except on July 4th. Additionally, ice cream parlors were a social hub for white Southerners and typically off limits to Blacks. If they were served at all, they were relegated to a separate window and prohibited from eating on the premises. What the specific role that vanilla ice cream played in all of these customs seems to be a bit ambiguous. Perhaps the consumption of the popular flavor was merely seen as a privilege reserved for whites. Arguably, the restriction of vanilla ice cream could serve as a clear boundary between Blacks and whites and remind them of their secondary status. Vanilla ice cream seemed to have served as a metaphor of showcasing the unnerving realities of Jim Crow. And in light of this bias, African American community seems to have gravitated more towards butter pecan ice cream. Roasted peanuts were a favorite of Native American communities long before they were incorporated into desserts, but credit for popularizing butter pecan as a culinary delicacy goes to Black Southerners who were known to integrate pecans into traditional dishes, suggesting the familiarity and preference for the ingredient. During segregation years, pecans became an integral part of African American cuisine, especially in New Orleans. The city's cuisine was famous for their pecans, which was tossed with butter and brown sugar before being cast into many different culinary delights. This ultimately led to the introduction into ice cream as a way to implement more ice cream flavors. As African Americans produced, churned, and sold butter pecan through neighborhood parlors, this fostered a sense of community and shared identity and economic independence in these segregated spaces. Basketball player Shaquille O'Neal recounted in his 2001 autobiography, Shaq Talks Back, that his father scolded him for wanting vanilla ice cream and insisting that they only ate butter pecan. Celebrity chef Gerby Garvin recalled that butter pecan ice cream became a regular part of his family's tradition, and former NFL player Albert Hainsworth recalled that butter pecan was the flavor of Black people. In the end, the Jim Crow laws and resulting racial etiquettes created a severe societal divide in the southern United States, and even when the context of something as simple as just consuming ice cream While there's no actual law that prevented African Americans eating vanilla ice cream, there are enough personal stories that indicate that this etiquette practice did exist, at least in some forms, in the southern United States. And the rise of butter pecan as the African American flavor of choice exemplifies our resiliency in the face of adversity. And it's a testament how African Americans continue to communicate their culture through our foods. The origins of barbecue as we know it can be traced back to native tribes in the Caribbean and their indigenous cooking methods. The first Spanish colonizers embarked on their New World voyages in the 15th century. They were fascinated by the techniques employed by the indigenous Taino people. The Native Americans would slow cook their meat over wooden structures over a pit of fire. This method was termed barbacoa, and this enthralled colonizers so much that they incorporated barbacoa into their Spanish lexicon, with it eventually becoming the word barbecue. The story of barbecue doesn't end with Spanish colonizers. These explorers took the cooking method of barbacoa with them to North America, where it was adopted by the local people and colonizers alike. The first known written mention of pork barbecue was around Mississippi. The book, The Historical Roots of the Yaknak Tapapa, 1540, 1962, authors Don Harrison Doyle wrote in December of 1540, near present-day Tupelo, Mississippi, the explorer Hernando de Soto and the Chickasaw tribe had a feast of Spanish cooked pork using the barbacoa method. By the 16th and 17th centuries, barbecue had become an integral part of everyday life in the southern part of North America, where there's even a painting from 16th century French explorer Jacques Lemoyne that shows Native Americans in Florida using a wooden frame over burning logs to cook a variety of foods like fish, mammals, and reptiles. George Washington, who was once charged with procuring meat for his soldiers during the French and Indian Wars, even talked about barbecuing in the Indian manner. With the arrival of enslaved Africans to the Americas in the 16th century, this caused a significant shift in the cultural and culinary landscape. Forced to adapt to a strange new environment, these Africans learned to sustain themselves through ingenious methods. They closely observed the cooking methods of the Native Americans, specifically the technique of barbecuing. This slow-cooked method was ideal for larger cuts of meat, which made it popular for communal gatherings. It's around this time that the groundwork was laid for the Southern style of pit barbecuing. However, the adaptation from the Native American techniques of suspended racks to in-pit barbecue is very murky. There is scant written references from the 18th century to shed light on this evolution. But despite the lack of documentation, it's plausible that this move into the ground was an inevitable progression. Around the same time was the introduction of unique African flavors and cooking techniques into barbecue by the enslaved community. Enslaved Africans didn't just learn Native American techniques of barbecuing, but they contributed their own, like the process of smoking meat over a gentle flame. It was a common practice in several African cultures and was originally designed to preserve the freshness of meat. This method eventually fused with the open pit cooking style that formed the basis for the barbecue style that we know today. Southern barbecue would gain popularity around the mid-1700s on Virginia plantations and then slowly make its way south from there. However, it's important to know that barbecues were not a regular event, but they were organized around holidays, special events, and political gatherings. Adrian Miller, the author of Black Smoke, a book around the history of Black barbecue, would state that by the 1830s, people believed that a proper barbecue required an African-American cook and his team. Barbecue was seen as a Black experience. Furthermore, because African Americans popularized pit cooking, they earned the title of pit master. Originally, pit masters were the elderly slaves that were proficient in cooking who supervised the barbecue preparation. Later on, the term pitmaster will become known more broadly. One of the earliest known references to a pitmaster was published in September 22, 1939 in the Daily Times News in Burlington, North Carolina. They wrote that Jeter Crutchfield, pitmaster, will supervise the beginning of a roasting pork for barbecue tonight at midnight. This is the first known use of the word pitmaster in print. And now, Jeter Crushfield was a white man, and it was not uncommon for white men to be the face of local barbecue. But more often than not, the ones doing the actual work were African Americans. It's also important to note that the article specifies that Jeter will supervise. But regardless, it tells us that the term pitmaster had become so wrapped into the lexicon that it's found its way into a newspaper article by the 1930s. What makes enslaved Africans' adaptation to barbecue so ingenious was that it was built amongst their limitations. Barbecue is a complex, laborious process that requires mastery and precision, from building an adequate fire to keeping consistent temperature for hours to expertly handling the meat to achieve a perfect blend of texture and flavor. They were often provided the least favorable, tougher cuts of meat, and these skilled chefs used this knowledge of seasoning and slow cooking to render these tough, overlooked cuts of meat delicious. By the Civil War, Southerners had been barbecuing for almost 2 centuries, and a great many of these cooks were African American slaves who tended these pits and barbecues organized for the white community, as well as events for their own family and friends. Sunday was often a day of rest and church sessions. This day became when enslaved people would barbecue for themselves. Thus, barbecue culture became an integral part of African American traditions. Today, celebrations like Juneteenth often center around barbecue, underlying the importance of barbecue within Black culture. After the Civil War, thousands of talented cooks in rural areas and small towns brought their barbecue tradition to hungry Southerners. Such examples was an African American cookbook author by the name of Abby Fisher, who was born into slavery in South Carolina in 1832 and shared her cooking skills while on plantation kitchens. After she obtained her freedom, she published a cookbook in 1881 named What Miss Fisher Knows About Old Southern Cooking. The cookbook does not contain any barbecue recipes, which is understandable because barbecuing was traditionally done by men outside in pits. However, one barbecue recipe stands out. It is called game sauce. The recipe calls for stewing a peck of plums after removing the stones with onions, vinegar, sugar, cayenne, black pepper, cinnamon, and salt, simmering the mixture for a full day, and she states that she will have the best barbecue sauce in the world. In the years after emancipation, Black barbecue traditions continued. While the names did not make the newspaper or other historical records, being a pitmaster was a high demand skill. And as freed African Americans began to form their own communities, they passed down this craft to the younger generations, and those traditions became integral into Black culture. Over time, Black cuisine and barbecue tradition became an essential part of larger American society, particularly in the southern United States, where it is now known as Southern barbecue. However, this adoption came with issues like cultural appropriation and accommodation. Today, barbecue has become increasingly popular within mainstream American society. It's considered an integral part of American cuisine. However, the widespread recognition often overlooks and glosses over the origins within Black culture. As a result, the origins of barbecue is often changed or even completely forgotten. Also, barbecue has become an increasingly profitable business. And with this, its cultural significance is washed away in a wave of commercial interest. Often, mainstream American barbecue business cherishes barbecue as purely American while hiding the Black history behind its influence. Despite the appropriation, the alteration, and accommodation, the tradition of barbecue still holds a special place within Black culture. It represents unity, resistance, strength, and freedom. This deep cultural meaning can be seen at Black family reunions, church gatherings, and other social events where barbecue is a crucial element. Moving from a survival strategy in enslaved Black community to a popular American tradition, barbecue shows the strength of shared culinary traditions and how they influence America's cultural identity. The concept of frying chicken goes all the way back to ancient Rome. A Roman cookbook named the Abacus was the first to suggest the recipe of fried chicken. However, it was the Moors who truly developed and refined the art of frying chicken in the Mediterranean. Traditional fried chicken as we know it has its origins in two distinct cultures, Scottish and West African. The Scots were the first to introduce the idea of frying chicken, which was quite different from the usual European cooking methods of baking and broiling. There was evidence that the Scots had been deep frying poultry in fat since the Middle Ages. An interesting piece of evidence from 1773 diary of the writer James Boswell wrote about a dinner he had in the Isle of Skye, which included fried chicken. One of the very first known written recipes of fried chicken comes in a British cookbook entitled The Art of Cookery, made plain and easy by Hannah Glass in 1747. The recipe, loved by both British and the American colonies, in the recipe calls to cut 2 pieces of chicken into quarters, lay them in vinegar for 2 to 4 hours with salt, pepper, a bay leaf, and cloves of garlic in very thick batter, first with a half a pint of wine and flour, then 2 egg yolks. Melt a little butter, grated oregano, some chopped parsley, beat very well, dip your fowls in the batter, and fry them up in a good deal of hog lard. While it was Scottish immigrants who first introduced fried chicken to the United States, they were definitely not the ones that popularized it. That was done by Western Africans. During that time period, Western Africans were very familiar with cooking chicken, and they usually used a braising technique. However, once in America, enslaved Africans used their culinary traditions to introduce the concepts of seasoning and spices and imbued the flavor and zest into an otherwise mundane dish. See, at the time, the Scots weren't putting any seasoning in their fried chicken. Upon arrival, enslaved people found themselves in an alien landscape amidst an unfamiliar food and culinary norms. Nonetheless, they were expected to utilize the ingredients that were accessible to them while continuing to draw on their deep culinary traditions. African culinary habits brusquely featured poultry and fowl, and chicken played a significant role, making this an easily adaptable ingredient when they reached the New World. Their culinary skill and ingenious improvisation of the enslaved people played a huge role in the growth and popularity of fried chicken. They combined their African cooking techniques with already available ingredients in America to create something completely different. For example, West African cultures use palm oil most often for frying foods. However, in America, enslaved Africans had to switch to using lard or pig fat or fat of other animals to fry chicken. This was because those ingredients were more readily available and less expensive. Chickens also played a significant part in the lives of enslaved people. Chickens were amongst the few animals that enslaved people were permitted to keep and care for, and they became a key part of their meals. Raising chickens was manageable and presented enslaved people with an opportunity to express some level of independence. Chickens also had economic importance because sometimes enslaved people were allowed to trade or sell their surplus eggs and meat for other goods. However, if a chicken fell sick or died, enslaved people were forced to eat it to avoid wasting the food. Therefore, they came up with the idea of cleaning and seasoning the meat, then frying it in hot oil. During slavery, fried chicken was a luxury reserved for special occasion. Although the recipe is extremely simple, preparing it took a lot of time, effort. Not everyone had access to the right kitchen tools or even the access to available poultry. Still, as more and more people tasted fried chicken, it began to disseminate across the South, and by the end of the Civil War, the connection between African Americans and fried chicken was already firmly established. In the period following the Civil War, mass-produced fried chicken and inexpensive oils became readily available. However, during the same time period, racial laws restricted employment opportunities for African Americans, particularly women. So they resorted to selling their homemade fried chicken, often considered Sunday meal, to travelers. This economic strategy helped propagate Southern railways and therefore solidified fried chicken as a Southern staple and a nationwide symbol. The best example of this took place in Gordonville, Virginia. Despite this small town of only 900 residents, Gordonville, Virginia was an important stop were two major railroad lines. During that time period, trains did not have dining cars, so passengers had to figure out how to feed themselves, and some would pack their own food, while others chose to purchase meals during their trip. Spotting a business opportunity, African American women used to sell their homemade food to passing travelers. They would serve fried chicken and pies and biscuits and deliver them to the hands of passengers on a platform through the train windows. The women were known as waiter carriers. But by the turn of the century, the majority of the trains began to equip with dining cars, and governmental regulations became more stringent for platform food vendors. And as a result, this innovative business tradition had to come to an end. During the Great Migration, many African Americans moved from the South to northern industrial cities, and they took their food traditions with them, including their beloved fried chicken that reminded them of their former homes. Over time, African Americans started to eat fried chicken as a staple meal after church. They also would serve the best part of the chicken, typically the breast, to the pastors as they visited the home. During this time, chicken would become known by gospel bird or the Sunday cluck. This would continue up until around World War II, when fried chicken was still only being enjoyed on special occasions. It was still relatively labor-intensive process. But by the 1950s, the popularity of fried chicken exploded due to the rise of fast food chains. Many entrepreneurs in the fast food industry saw America's passion for fried chicken and decided to capitalize on it. Companies started to brainstorm ways to quickly cook up a massive amount of fried chicken and serve them fresh to their customers. It was during this time period that fried chicken went from being a national American dish to an international dish. However, it was also during this time period, during the Jim Crow era, where racial stereotypes between African Americans were closely tied to fried chicken, asserting Black folks as poultry thieves and ravenous eaters of fried chicken. This portrayal cast African Americans as inherently savage and unintelligent, as predatory, lustful beings who exhibited primal, uncontrollable affection for food, particularly fried chicken. In 1915, the film The Birth of a Nation popularized the trope of African Americans as chicken thieves, painting them as dim-witted and lazy. In one scene, elected Black officials were seen swigging from whiskey bottles and putting their bare feet on tables, while another man is seen ravenously gnawing on a chicken bone. Such imagery permeated deep into the 19th century, and these stereotypes continuously showed in various types of movies and media and TV shows and advertisements. These often showed African Americans indulging in specific types of foods like fried chicken and watermelon. This was propagated to the point to insinuate that African Americans were less intelligent and highlighted white society's perceived cultural and racial superiority. This stereotype was often employed with the humor trope to belittle Blacks, thus underscoring Black people's subjugated status. In today's world, the stereotype persists, and the media plays a significant role in establishing and perpetuating and amplifying these stereotypes. From racist depictions, minstrel shows, to negative portrayals and modern advertisements, media contributed significantly towards the racial myth-making of fried chicken. Even as attempts to counter these negative stereotypes in contemporary media, old tropes occasionally resurface and underline the persistence and cultural baggage that fried chicken seems to carry. In 2010, a Kentucky Fried Chicken commercial in Australia depicted a white person calming down a rowdy crowd of Black people with fried chicken. While the ad was labeled as racist, it's also seen as an example of exactly how these stereotypes continue to spread. It forced KFC to apologize publicly and pull the ad. However, despite these stereotypes propagating in the media, many African American chefs and food writers have made efforts to attempt to reclaim the narrative and highlight the historical and cultural significance of fried chicken. They continue to elevate Southern traditional meals, including fried chicken, to the realm of gourmet cuisine. And the success of Black-owned businesses shows that African American entrepreneurs can succeed despite these stereotypes. Strides are being taken to dismantle these stereotypes, but the work is ongoing. As historian Michael Twitty points out, fried chicken is a soul food classic, but it's not the whole of African Americans' culinary heritage. Nonetheless, fried chicken continues to remain a staple in many African American gatherings and celebrations, and resembling resilience, resourcefulness, and culinary creativity amidst a history fraught with hardship and repression. Macaroni is a dried, molded pasta traditionally made from wheat flour and water. Its origins back to ancient Greece. The term macaroni comes from the Greek word for maker, meaning blessed. The pasta became an integral part of the Mediterranean diet and subsequently permeated its way through Greek, Roman, and Arabic cultures. However, the inclusion of cheese into the equation did not come into existence much later in Europe. First known recipes for a macaroni and pasta type dish was de lesanes, which required layering sheets of pasta with cheese and spices. It can be found in one of the oldest Middle-aged cookbooks called The Form of Curry, which was compiled by cooks of England's King Richard II in the 14th century. However, a more recognizable form of the dish originated in Italy, where certain types of pastas and cheese in a casserole were documented all the way back to the 13th century Italian cookbook called the Liber de Cucina. But macaroni and cheese, as we know it, was introduced to the Americas by Thomas Jefferson, but he didn't cook the dish himself. During his tenure as an envoy in France, Thomas Jefferson enjoyed a similar type pasta dish in France, and he commissioned his enslaved black cook by the name of James Hemings to learn how to make it. James Hemings was the older brother of Sally Hemings, who was also the half-brother of Jefferson's deceased wife. In 1784, when Hemings was just 19 years old, he traveled with Jefferson and his daughter to Paris. In Paris, James trained under different French chefs. Over the next 5 years, he became a master of French cooking and got particularly good at cooking macaroni pie. This was a creamy pasta dish that eventually turned into what we know as macaroni and cheese. The recipe involved using whatever cheese he had on hand, layering it in between buttered macaroni mixed with milk. He would then cook it in a Dutch oven, which he placed over a fireplace, and hot coals would be placed over the lid to bake the macaroni and cheese. Even though Hemings' crucial contribution to cooking and he was famous as a chef, he remained relatively unknown. This was because he was still enslaved under Thomas Jefferson until 1796, and he was one of only 2 slaves that Jefferson set free, and that was only under the condition that James would teach his younger brother, Peter, to take over in his place as Jefferson's cook of the household. Peter Hemings would then serve the dish at a state dinner in 1802, making it famous. Unfortunately for James, he would pass away at 36 in 1801, but Hemings' most important impact on American food culture was his introduction, macaroni and cheese. Adrian Miller, who is the author of Black Smoke, African Americans in the United States of Barbecue, explains about Hemings that its story is a metaphor for African American cooking and our experience in this country. It's the story of innovation and virtuosity. Often African American cooks get overlooked for our contributions and our accomplishments. In the early 19th century, the dish we call macaroni and cheese was primarily a food of the elite. This was because dried macaroni was not commonly accessible and Americans didn't know how to make good quality pasta. In addition to this, Italian cheeses, which was a key ingredient in macaroni and cheese, was too expensive for most Americans. As the century progressed, the Industrial Revolution dramatically changed the accessibility and the popularity of mac and cheese in the United States. The production process in making macaroni and cheese became more affordable and more widely available, made it more popular with the lower classes. The establishment of the first cheese factories in this country amplified the production of cheddar cheese, which soon became the common ingredient in macaroni and cheese, thus making the meal even more suitable for poor communities. It was during this time we also see macaroni and cheese lose its Italian and French origins and become a more crucial part of Western cooking. For the African American community, after emancipation, the dish bore 2 distinct identities and varied in significance. One was a quick side dish for weekdays, and the other was a more elaborate meal celebrated for Sunday suppers. It was during this time period that macaroni and cheese evolved in the South among African American communities and became what we know as baked macaroni and cheese. This dish was also based in hard times when the Black community desired to dress up their macaroni and cheese, thus began a tradition of baking layers of macaroni and cheese. During the Great Migration, where African Americans moved from the South to northern industrial centers, this continued to spread in the popularity of macaroni and cheese, thus making it a well-known dish within the Black community across the United States. Additionally, it was Black women, first the enslaved, then later domestic workers, that were instrumental in the dish's trajectory. Their cooking skills and knowledge greatly impacted how this dish had evolved, reinforcing the role of Black women in shaping American cuisine. With macaroni and cheese becoming a common dish among Black families, it began to reflect the craft and ingenuity of these Black women. Its importance within the culture was so high that sometimes a family member's approval was needed before it could be cooked for special occasions. In 1918, there was a Swiss invention that changed the food industry forever. It was processed cheese. Over the years, this innovation led to products we recognize even today, such as Kraft Singles, Easy Cheese, powdered sauce that comes in the mac and cheese box, and of course, Velveeta. This is when macaroni and cheese really took off. In 1937, Kraft launched its boxed macaroni and cheese. It was a cost-effective meal choice in one simple box. Priced at only 19 cents, it could feed a family of 4. Consumers responded strongly to the reliable, affordable meal option, and in just 1 year, Kraft sold 8 million boxes of boxed macaroni and cheese. During World War II, food rationing and tightened domestic spending, this made Kraft boxed macaroni and cheese even more appreciated as a food staple. Shoppers found that they could purchase 2 boxes of macaroni and cheese with only 1 food stamp. It was during these years that boxed macaroni and cheese earned its reputation as American treasured comfort food. Macaroni and cheese became a reflection of the United States with its convenient packaging and industrialization. It was the ideal American food. Pasta and processed cheese. They were very cheap to make. It was easy to ship and store, and it was very filling. While African American families did opt for this cheaper, easier to make meal, they didn't relinquish the tradition of preparing baked macaroni and cheese from scratch for special occasions. Macaroni and cheese continued to be an essential part of family gatherings and special meals in the Black community, particularly during the holidays such as Thanksgiving and Christmas. It was considered more than an everyday comfort food. It was an integral part of celebratory feasts and cherished symbolic representation of the community cohesion. While there are many ways to prepare this dish, there was a standardization of the recipe that happened in Black kitchens in the 50s when it was referred to as soul mac and cheese. This consisted of macaroni, a substantial portion of cheese, butter, milk, often topped with breadcrumbs or cheese, which is baked to achieve a golden crust. During the 60s, mac and cheese became an even more integral part of the community. It was a symbol of the community's strength and unity. During this time of the civil rights movement, mac and cheese was a common dish at gatherings and meetings, and women who were referred to as movement mothers handed down coveted recipes and their techniques, and mac and cheese became to symbolize more than a comfort food. It stood as an emblem of community strength, unity, and resistance in the face of racial inequalities and systemic prejudices. That tradition continues today, with mac and cheese still being a significant part of Black cultural cuisine. Its ceremonial presence during the holidays and family gatherings and religious events, it goes beyond just a hearty pasta to a cultural icon that has ingrained itself in our shared history and identity. Despite the stereotypes and stigma that continue to categorize mac and cheese as an unhealthy soul food, mac and cheese continues to evolve in Black kitchens. Chefs keep adding their own twists to the classic recipe while respecting its historical importance. They continue to reinvent this comfort food and inserting their own personal touches that reflects Black culinary innovation and heritage. Thomas Jefferson was a founding father in the United States, but he was also a plantation owner and over his lifetime owned over 600 enslaved individuals. At his peak, he owned 140 enslaved individuals at his Monticello estate, one of these being the Heming family. The intricate relationship between the Hemings lineage and Thomas Jefferson is predominantly traced back to Jefferson's union with Martha Waylands. This marriage brought the Heming family into Jefferson's life, primarily as part of the estate that he inherited from Martha's father, John Waylands. The connection between Martha and the Hemings extends beyond mere ownership. They share a common parental lineage through Elizabeth Hemings, who was an enslaved woman who was enslaved by Waylands and bore several of his children. This shared ancestry ties Martha and Hemings together through bloodlines and bondage. Within this complex relationship, James Hemings and Sally Hemings stand out as central figures embodying the deeply intertwined destinies between the Hemings family and Thomas Jefferson. James Hemings was born in 1765. He was one of the children of John Waylands. This familial link thus made him Jefferson's brother-in-law when Martha was married to Jefferson. Despite the constraints of his enslaved status, Hemings was able to carve out a niche for himself within the hierarchical structure of the Monticello estate, particularly through his refinement and expertise of his culinary talents. His sister, though, Sally Hemings, is the more widely recognized due to her complex relationship with Thomas Jefferson. After Martha Jefferson's demise, there was a lot of conjecture concerning the intimate relationship between Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson. These allegations suggested that Jefferson fathered several of Hemings' children, and the emergence of DNA evidence in 1998 led credence to the assertion that Jefferson likely fathered at least one, if not all, of Sally Hemings' children. But that's a story for another day. James Hemings, though, from his youth, exhibited a proficiency for illiteracy, which was rare given the prevalence of anti-literacy statutes that prohibited the education of enslaved individuals. Thomas Jefferson recognized Hemings' potential and chose to cultivate it, driven not by benevolence, but by a desire to increase the value of his enslaved property. This investment exhibited extraordinary culinary talents and remarkable use of his acquired skills despite the constraints of his bondage. Jefferson, recognizing his talents, when James was 19, he embarked on a significant journey from Boston to Paris with Thomas Jefferson and his sister Sally. Following Jefferson's appointment as America's trade minister in 1784, Jefferson facilitated his apprenticeship under esteemed chefs at the Chateau de la Chantilly, a culinary establishment that was unparalleled in its reputation during the 18th century. This apprenticeship was a privilege seldom afforded to even the local French population, providing Hemings with a comprehensive education in the intricacies of French cuisines, from pastry making to the art of sauce preparation and the nuances of kitchen management. While in Paris, James was appointed as the chef of cuisine at Jefferson's private home, the Hotel d'Anjac, where he supervised a kitchen team, including white servants. This contrasted greatly with his life in America. Despite earning half of what the previous chef made, James managed to impress everyone with his skillful blending of French and American techniques, resulting in unique cuisine. He also used a part of his wages to hire a tutor and learn French. James and Sally would soon discover that a French law allowed slaves to seek freedom upon stepping on French soil. Still, they didn't take advantage of this law, possibly because they wanted to avoid being separated from their family back in the United States. In 1789, the Hemings siblings and Thomas Jefferson traveled from France back to America, specifically to Jefferson's Monticello estate. While in America, Hemings worked as Jefferson's personal chef and received wages for his work. As the national government moved around in what would become the United States of America, so did Jefferson and Hemings. They lived in New York City for a time, with Hemings running the kitchen there, and Philadelphia in 1791. Hemings put his culinary skills to use. Using the knowledge gained in France, Hemings brought French culinary techniques to create uniquely American foods. It was during this time, while residing in Philadelphia, a state where slavery was abolished, that James initiated negotiations with Thomas Jefferson for his emancipation. Recognizing his culinary prowess, Jefferson consented to his manumission with a condition. He had to pass on his cooking expertise to another enslaved individual. Hemings handpicked his younger brother, Peter, for this role. This choice fulfilled two desires. First, he would finally be free, and secondly, it would help his brother Peter lead a better life under the circumstances. For 2 years, Hemings taught Peter everything he knew about cooking, so Peter could continue to make meals at the Jefferson estate. In 1796, when he was 31 years old, Jefferson finally signed his Emancipation Papers, and Hemings had a chance to start a new life. Now a free man, Hemings faced the daunting task of making his own way in 18th century America. He left the Jefferson estate of Monticello and settled in cities like Philadelphia and Baltimore, where he lived among other free blacks and worked as a professional chef. Despite his liberty and his impressive culinary skills, his freedom did not shield him from the realities of 18th century America. Unfortunately, there are only a few records to shed light on his experiences after he was set free. But what we do know is that in a strange twist of fate, Hemings found himself once again in a dialogue with Thomas Jefferson. When Jefferson requested Hemings' service for a second time, Hemings responded through Francis Sayers, another chef who he had worked with in New York and Philadelphia. Hemings indicated that he was willing to work with Jefferson, but felt uncomfortable about the prospect of working with unfamiliar servants. He asked Jefferson to write him directly, outlining the terms and conditions of the job offer. While Jefferson never wrote back, Hemings did briefly work at Monticello for about a month and a half in the kitchen, earning about $30 before moving on. The trajectory of James Hemings' life took a dark turn in 1801 when he died under very curious circumstances. It's widely believed that he committed suicide, and the factors that would compel him to take his own life were completely speculative. It's postulated, though, that his personal adversities, possibly including being ostracized from his family and the challenges of navigating a prejudiced society, might have overwhelmed him in his final years. James Hemings had a profound effect on American cuisine, and one of his biggest achievements was just introducing foods like ice cream, mac and cheese, creme brulee, and French fries to America. He brought back many recipes from France and added his own spin using ingredients that he could find here in the States. For example, the classic mac and cheese is linked to a similar dish in France called macaroni pie. He then made his own version in America, and it became popular when his brother Peter served it at a state dinner in 1802. Hemings also had a knack for making sweet treats. He used vanilla, sugar, cream, and an egg yolk to make fancy but extremely hard to make ice cream that was a big hit at Jefferson's parties. Another French dish that he brought back to American tables was French fries. Hemings tasted those in France, tweaked the recipe to make his own American version, and added it to the menu in Monticello. Jefferson started promoting them, and French fries became a popular dish all over the country. Beyond specific dishes, Hemings' broader influence lies in his role in blending French and culinary practices with American ingredients. This fusion approach laid the groundwork for what is now being celebrated as American cuisine, a melting pot of various techniques from other countries and traditions. Hemings proved that American dishes could possess the refinement and complexity of European cuisine while celebrating the local ingredients and tastes. Hemings, who spoke both French and English, left behind important notes to help us learn more about his legacy beyond his cooking skills. These documents found at the Library of Congress include a list of kitchen tools, his own handwriting, and some recipes that he had created. They show us that Hemings was a very talented chef and offer us a glimpse into his fascinating life. Today, Hemings is finally getting the recognition that he deserves for his impact on American cuisine. His influence is being showcased at exhibits and at food events that honor his memory and celebrate his role in shaping early American cuisine. This new understanding goes beyond his knowledge and his cooking abilities, and it's a meaningful tribute to all the enslaved individuals like Hemings, whose contributions to American culture often go ignored and forgotten. Collard greens are a dark green leafy vegetable that is popular around the globe for their taste and their high concentration of vitamins A, C, and K. Collard greens are some of the oldest members of the cabbage family, also known as the tree cabbage. Originating in the Eastern Mediterranean, the name collard is derived from colewort, which means the cabbage plant. Despite their name, collard greens do not grow tight heads like cabbages. Indeed, they are part of the cabbage family, but they're more closely similar to kale. Collard greens were made popular in Europe by the Greeks and the Romans. Ancient Greeks grew kale and collard greens together and made little distinction between the two. Historians are unsure on whether or not Romans discovered greens through the Greeks or if they started growing them independently. When the Romans went on their conquest of what is now the United Kingdom, they introduced collard greens to European diets around the 4th century BC. Their introduction to Africa, however, comes long before transatlantic slave trade and became a dominant part of African people's diets, even to this day. Many countries in Africa, especially those in Eastern Africa, love the green leafy vegetable, which is known as sukuma wiki. Preparing the collard greens often involves boiling or steaming as they are served as accompaniments to either meat or fish. They can also be supportive ingredients in soups and stews or with other vegetables. After becoming a staple of European diets, collard greens were brought to the Americas by European settlers in the 17th century. This happened during a period known as the Columbian Exchange, which is an historical event involving the transfer of various goods, animals, plants, people, and even diseases between Europe, West Africa, and the Americas. Collard greens were loved in the southern part of the United States because other plants struggled to grow during cold winter months. In fact, collard greens were so resilient that they could survive through all seasons, but they generally thrived from around January to April. When enslaved Africans were brought here to the United States, they didn't leave their culinary traditions behind. They brought along their traditions and the practices of cooking collard greens. While their oppressors may have consumed select foods, enslaved people were left with the leftovers, which included the harder stems of the collard greens. Despite these tough circumstances, the enslaved Africans showcased their creativity by transforming simple collard greens into flavorful meals. The classic recipe included simmering collard greens slowly in a pot of water until they became tender with either salt pork, ham hocks, or turkey necks to balance out the tough texture and the bitter taste of the greens. Food historian Michael Twitty would state that many culinary historians agree that the green craze in the South is supported by the spring greens among Celtic and Germanic Southerners, but it was really spearheaded by people of African descent. The greens were then served with homemade cornbread, and the practice involved dipping the bread into the broth that remained in the pot, fondly known as the pot liquor. The liquor is the leftover soup at the bottom of the pot that was created from the extended cooking process of leafy greens or beans. After the greens have been cooked thoroughly, the nutrients would often seep to the bottom of the pot. This is basically the liquor that is left in the bottom of the pot. According to Southern wisdom, the pot liquor will cure what ails you, and if nothing ails you, it will at least clean you out. The connection between collard greens and African Americans is deeply rooted in historical and the cultural experience. The labor-intensive process of cooking collard greens involves cleaning, chopping, and slow simmering, often for hours, with ham hocks or smoked turkey to amplify the flavor, reflects the strenuous hardships of African Americans and how they had to endure them throughout their history. This food preparation ritual is passed down through generations and is intertwined with stories of both struggle and success. Thus, the tradition of cooking and consuming collard greens has evolved beyond a cultural staple. Today stands as a symbol of both wealth and prosperity. This is especially true on New Year's Day dinners. Within the African American community, collard greens is served with black-eyed peas and hog fat on New Year's Day and promises to bring good luck and financial reward. Hanging a fresh collard green leaf on your door is said to ward off evil spirits, and a fresh leaf placed on your forehead promises to cure headache. During the Jim Crow period, many restaurants would not serve African Americans, and this led to them relying on home-cooked meals or food from Black-owned restaurants, creating what we now know as soul food. This kind of cuisine was filled with affordable, nutrient-rich ingredients like collard greens, cornbread, sweet potatoes, and pork. As it was a comfort food, it created a sense of community during tough times. Soul food became an integral part of the African American experience. Soul food also played a vital role in church gatherings in the Black community and helped spread the popularity of collard greens across the country. As a result of the awareness and appreciation, restaurants began to serve soul food classics like collard greens, pushing these flavors from niche family meals into the mainstream. During the Great Migration, numerous African Americans relocated from the agrarian South into more industrialized northern and western cities in pursuit of better jobs and a better quality of life. Amidst this unfamiliar territory and this new urban lifestyle came ready-made meals, but these African Americans carried with them their Southern traditions. Their culinary practice of eating and consuming collard greens made their way to their new homes and provided them with a nostalgic connection back to their Southern roots. It was like having a piece of Southern tradition in a new, unfamiliar place. During the Civil Rights Movement, food played an important part and went far beyond just keeping people fed. Soul food suppers, which served collard greens, were a significant part of the African American community, and they served two important roles. Firstly, they raised money for the Civil Rights Movement. Secondly, these food traditions kept a sense of culture and heritage alive during a stressful, challenging period. Adrian Miller, the author of Soul Food as a Culinary Creation, explains how food was able to create a strong sense of belonging. Dishes like collard greens and fried chicken helped create a unified African American identity and was critical to the success of the Civil Rights Movement. However, some people did see collard greens in a negative light. They viewed them as a symbol of hardship and of the bitter history of enslavement. A number of educated African Americans thought the soul food, which included collard greens, was not healthy or nearly polished enough. They tried to distance themselves from the traditional food and aimed to adopt what they viewed as a more elevated eating habits. Despite this, during the Black Power movement in the early 70s, the opinion of these foods changed once again, as foods like collard greens were now being looked on as a form of protest against oppression. These foods were a way of celebrating African American culture and racial pride, despite the continual attempts to hold back and erase the African American historical experience. The views on collard greens have evolved a lot since the Civil Rights Movement and the Black Power movement. And even though the reputation of soul food being unhealthy has lingered, changes have started to happen in how these foods are being made. For example, traditional dishes like collard greens have begun to be slow cooked with healthier ingredients and less salt, and other methods like sauteing and stir frying were being used to try to keep the tradition alive while being considered more healthy. Today, collard greens have gained popularity due to their increasingly health-conscious individuals. They provide a high amount of vitamins A, C, and K, and fiber, as well as other minerals. Because of these beneficial nutrients, the African American community in particular has started to recognize the healthiness of collard greens and try to highlight the nutrient-rich nature of the greens to shake off the negative opinion that surrounds soul food as a whole. Collard greens are an essential part of soul food. It's a type of cuisine that originates directly from African American roots. From the Night Watch, which is an event that remembers the Emancipation Proclamation, to casual get-togethers, family gatherings, and other traditional holidays, collard greens continue to signify a symbol of African American history and heritage. The word chitterling was first documented in the English language around the year 1400. It was spelled Chitterlings. Linguist Paul Anthony Jones pointed out that during the late 1500s, chitterlings referred to a fancy type of neck ruffle. It's possible that the name came about from their frilly edges resembled the internal folds of an animal's intestines. The earliest origins of chitterlings trace back to the Middle Ages in Europe, particularly in the United Kingdom and France, where they formed an integral part of impoverished peasants' dietary repertoire. During this period, less desirable parts of the pig, including the intestines, were left for the consumption of the poorer classes, while the upper classes ate their choice of meat. This was a matter of necessity, as the idea of waste was not a concept that could be entertained much during the Middle Ages. During that same time period, cooking chitlins was a labor-intensive task involving washing, boiling, often frying before they could be consumed. They were often boiled with onions and covered in a sauce made from a broth. In 1743, the British cookbook entitled The Lady's Companion, or The Infallible Guide to the Fair Sex, included a recipe for calf Chitterlings. This dish was essentially a type of sausage that contained bacon and offal, which is a variety of internal organs of an animal, all inside the casing of a calf intestine. The reason was given for using calf intestines instead of the usual pig intestines was because the recipe was meant for the summer when pigs were not commonly slaughtered. This recipe was later shared by Arthur Hannah Glass in the famous 1784 cookbook, The Art of Cookery. Meanwhile, in Asia, chitterlings were adopted into local cuisine with a variety of preparation methods and seasoning, and in keeping in regional culinary standards. In China, for instance, chitterlings had been cooked for over 1,000 years, and they were often used in stews, braises, and in stir fries. While chitterlings were familiar to some cultures in Africa, they were primarily introduced to the diets of enslaved Africans in the Americas during their enslavement. The plantation owners would often slaughter pigs for their meat, reserving the premium cuts for themselves. The leftover parts of the pig, feet, the head, the heart, the neck bones, and the intestines were often given to the enslaved. Hence, chitterlings or chitlins became a regular feature on the tables of the enslaved. Unlike other soul foods that had a common lineage in Southern cuisine, chitlins remained strong ties to their African heritage. This connection stemmed from the West African tradition of eating all edible parts of plants and animals. These foods helped maintain the enslaved survival in the United States, and they were forced to rely heavily on chitlins because they were both cheap and readily available. To make the most out of less desirable parts, the enslaved will often slow cook or boil their chitlins, usually adding inexpensive vegetables. This was an effective way to get many nutrients out of the meat as possible. Even though their diet was mainly filled with carbohydrates, this process shows how enslaved people were resourceful in making the most out of a tough situation and provides their resilience and ability to create nutritious meals out of leftovers. The preparation of chitlins would then evolve into an art form. The meticulous task of cleaning, preparing, and cooking. The cooking method was often slow and designed to tenderize the tough meat and sought to enhance the flavor with already available seasonings such as onions, garlic, chili, and vinegar. These cooking methodologies witnessed an evolution over time was based on the ingredients that they had on hand or regional leanings, displaying the creativity and adaptability of enslaved Africans in the face of stark adversity. In the post-emancipation era, popularity of chitlins continued despite segregation laws, underscoring their cultural significance. Many restaurants served chitlins as a part of their range of dishes, now referred to as soul food. Chitlins became a staple in many African American homes and often had a special place at the table during holiday periods such as Christmas or New Year's. This is not simply because it was delicious, but it's also because it carried a powerful message of hope, good luck, and wealth for the coming year. Chitlins was not only about food, but about family unity, which made them a favorite dishes at family reunions and community events. These occasions were a great way for older family members to show the younger ones how to prepare chitlins, thereby ensuring the tradition continues. Particularly during the Civil Rights era, chitlins found themselves at the heart of African American social gatherings, family celebrations, and festivals. Chitlins was so closely linked to Black culture that there was once an informal collection of entertainment venues mostly attended by Black audiences called the Chitlin Circuit. Today, young people have a wide variety of food available and may not feel as closely linked to chitlins. Some may view it as a symbol of poverty and wish to separate themselves from this aspect of their diet. Chitlins also would become associated with slave food. This happens because a person's wealth and social status was determined by the part of the pig which they consumed. Initially, the enslaved and later poor individuals often ate pig's feet, the stomach, or the chitlins because they were cheaper, but they also were physically lower on the pig. People with more means, on the other hand, generally ate the pricier portions of meat like the back or upper leg of the pig. And this is where the expression high on the hog comes from, because it literally meant rich people eating physically higher portions of the hog. Moreover, people were now paying attention to their diet and how that affected their health. Chitlins were known for their high caloric and cholesterol content and have been linked to health problems such as obesity and heart disease. These problems were prevalent in the African American community, leading many to steer clear of traditional dish like chitlins, comparing them to unhealthy foods and sugary drinks. Also, preparing chitlins is a extremely time-consuming process and not conducive to the quick-paced lifestyle that we now live. Tasks like cleaning intestines can take hours and is challenging for families, especially working ones. Young people prefer a faster and more ready-to-eat meals. Chitlins also stir up discussions about identity and history. They are so deeply rooted in African American culture. Some view them as a sign of resilience and a way to stand up for social justice, while others view them as a reminder of the stark reality of slavery. While some people have distanced themselves from chitlins, others are exploring new ways to prepare and enjoy them. Chefs are inventing healthier recipes like using leaner pork parts or adding more vegetables and spices. There are even vegetarian versions of chitlins that are being developed using mushrooms or burdock root. In popular culture, chitlins often used as a nostalgic comfort food. For example, in the book A Color Purple, they use it as a symbol of the family's bonds. Also, Chef Carla Hall once wrote in her book about her experiences and the importance of chitlins in her family, especially during the holidays. She emphasizes their cultural significance and the family bonds that cooking chitlins help create. Chitlins are not just a food. They represent African American heritage and family. They are an example of the creativity despite hardships and show people how Black people found a way to make tasty meals out of the literal worst part of the pig. Chitlins are a testament to African American tradition, representing survival, creativity, and community. The buffalo wing is an iconic American food that has enjoyed a mediocre rise since its inception in the later half of the 20th century, characterized by its spicy and tangy, often served with celery sticks and blue cheese dressing. It's become a staple of American cuisine. The history, however, is rich and varied and cannot be attributed to a single individual or a moment, but rather a cultural shift and a profound appreciation for casual, flavorful, deep-fried food. The allure of buffalo wings can be attributed to a couple of factors: the unique flavor, the versatility, and the communal dining experience they promote. The wings are doused in hot sauce that is both tangy and spicy and appeals to a wide range of palates and has inspired countless variations and adaptations across the globe, from mild to blistering hot to sweet to savory. Adaptability of the buffalo wing caters to an array of taste preferences and fosters its own widespread popularity. Additionally, buffalo wings are celebrated for their versatility. They are favorite choice for various occasions, from casual gatherings at sports bars to home parties to everything in between. The food item effortlessly crosses the boundaries between high-end cuisine and street food, with the casual nature of eating buffalo wings often with one hand that makes the dining experience even more engaging and informal. And lastly, another reason for their popularity is the sense of community and camaraderie that it inspires. Typically, they're served in large portions meant for sharing. They encourage communal eating, making them popular choice at sporting events, family gatherings, and social outings. This aspect of sharing togetherness taps into a fundamental human experience. When it comes to the history of buffalo wings, it centers around the Anchor Bar, a family-owned restaurant in Buffalo, New York. However, a equally vital but lesser known contributor to the development of the buffalo wing comes with an African-American restaurateur by the name of John Young. Chicken wings have had its place in both restaurants and home cooking for years. In Buffalo, the oldest establishment to serve chicken wings is the Clarendon Hotel. A copy of the hotel's menu dates back to July 1st, 1857, and lists an entire entree of chicken wings fried. In addition to this menu, Cynthia Van Ness, the director of the Library and Archives in Buffalo's History Museum, also found a recipe for chicken wings that dates back to 1894 issue of the Buffalo Commercial Advertiser. But the common narrative around the invention of the buffalo wing is with Teresa Bellismo, the co-owner of the Anchor Bar in 1964. According to the story, Teresa concocted the dish one night as a late-night snack for her son and his friends, finding themselves with an excess of chicken wings, as this part of the chicken at the time was largely used for either stock or thrown away. She decided to deep fry them and toss them in cayenne pepper hot sauce that she had on hand and served them alongside celery slices and blue cheese dressing. It was an immediate hit and eventually became a staple at the bar and spread across the United States. But chicken wings were not just an entree in Buffalo, New York. By the 1960s, a Washington, D.C. restaurant named Wings and Things was serving chicken wings in mumbo sauce. The sauce has its roots in Chicago, but has since become very closely related to Washington, D.C. This may have inspired John Young to begin serving his wings in mumbo sauce at his similarly named restaurant, Wings and Things, in Buffalo. Young moved to Buffalo from Alabama and began serving breaded chicken wings in his own special mumbo sauce around the mid-60s. His restaurant was called John Young's Wings and Things, and this was around the same time that the Bellismo family claimed to have invented buffalo wings. Unlike chicken wings at the Anchor Bar that were covered in a vinegar-based cayenne hot sauce and served without breading, John Young's were different. His version of chicken wings were larger, breaded, and coated in a thick tomato-based sauce. This was Young's own special concoction, and he referred to his wings as mambo wings and served them at his restaurant on Jefferson Avenue in Buffalo, New York. Now, it's unclear when exactly Young opened his restaurant in Buffalo. Although he applied for a restaurant license for Wings and Things in 1966, interviews with Young and former customers indicate that he most likely was selling food under that name long before he applied for a license to do so. In any case, Young's restaurant became known for serving breaded whole wings in mambo sauce. Early media coverage around buffalo wings predominantly featured Frank and Teresa Bellismo. In 1972, the Buffalo Evening News published an article highlighting buffalo wings served by the couple, propelling them into the national spotlight. This exposure led to a feature in Associated Press article, a cooking show appearance, and most notably a 1980 article in the New Yorker by Calvin Trillin. Trillin's piece, however, introduced a counter-argument by John Young, who had challenged Bellismo's claim to the invention of the buffalo wing. Young had relocated to Illinois in 1970. When he came back almost a decade later to Buffalo, he was shocked by the proliferation and marketing of buffalo wings. Specifically, he was surprised by the Anchor Bar claiming to have invented the dish when he believed that Frank Bellismo had been inspired by him. Young stated that I was selling 5,000 pounds of chicken wings in 1962, and Mr. Bellismo used to come into my place and eat my wings. Young's assertion of his pioneering role in the buffalo wing led to some recognition for him being the inventor of the buffalo wing, but the damage was mostly done. By the 1970s, restaurants in Buffalo began to feature their own version of wings, which adhered to the Anchor Bar's recipe of frying the wings, breaking them into drumlets, and tossing them in hot sauce. Commonly, these wings were accompanied by sides, such as blue cheese dressing or celery sticks, but nevertheless, some establishments sought to innovate how they served these wings. Some places would serve them with pizza. By the 1980s, Buffalo-style wings began to permeate restaurant menus outside of Buffalo, New York, marking their ascension to American cuisine. The inception of Buffalo Wild Wings, initially called Buffalo Wild Wings and Rec, in 1982 in Columbus, Ohio, would underscore this expansion. As buffalo wings continued to proliferate nationwide, they became increasingly synonymous with American sports culture, especially football and the Super Bowl in particular, solidifying their status as the quintessential game day food. John Young would pass away in 1998, but in 2020, his daughter, Linda Brown Young, began to serve his father's chicken wing recipe on Buffalo Bike Tour's historical wing ride. which honors John Young as the king of wings. There have been some recent efforts to sought to amend this historical oversight by acknowledging Young's contribution. Culinary historians and food writers, along with the Buffalo community, have aimed to ensure that Young's legacy is preserved. This includes coverage and articles and documentaries that highlight Young's innovative role in the significance of buffalo wings and bringing mumbo sauce to the local cuisine. Community leaders and historians in Buffalo have advocated for Young's deserved recognition, emphasizing the varied origins of the buffalo wings and celebrating the diversity of their contributions. These acknowledgments not only honor Young's legacy, but also enrich the local narrative of the buffalo wing, acknowledging the diverse origins and the contributions of African Americans to the national culinary landscape. Banana pudding is a quintessential Southern delicacy that can be traced back to the late 19th century. Bananas emerged for the first time in American soil in 1804. Originating from Africa, bananas were a rarity in the early United States. The scarcity of supply throughout the 1840s, 1850s made them a luxurious novelty that only made sporadic appearances in Atlantic ports. But after the Civil War, the landscape began to change, spurred by advancements in steam technology and some entrepreneurial oversight from American businessmen recognizing a potential market for bananas previously considered an exotic luxury. These pioneers, through companies like the United Fruit Company, developed extensive banana plantations in Central and South America during the 1870s. They leveraged refrigeration, transportation means to tackle the spoilage issue, and thus making bananas both popular and affordable in the United States. By the turn of the century, there was a surge in importations, with ports like New Orleans become a critical node for the banana trade. This led to bananas becoming a staple in American diets. This newfound accessibility also coincided with the American public's introduction to English desserts like trifle and custards, setting the stage for banana pudding. The early origins of the word pudding were originally tied to sausages, but broadened in the Middle Ages to encompass sweet and savory dishes. British cuisine had expanded to include a gamut of ingredients, notably leading to the development of the custard, which is a cornerstone of banana pudding. The first notable recipe appeared in Massachusetts with housekeeping. This also predates the use of widespread vanilla wafers. The showcase of the dessert was built around layers of a sponge cake, bananas, and a custard with a topping of whipped cream, reminiscent to an English trifle. This period also witnessed the evolution of banana pudding recipes across various publications, each including their own twists, from sponge cake to ladyfingers to custards and tapioca variations. The early 20th century represented a turning point for banana pudding because of two significant developments: the advent of commercial instant vanilla pudding, which simplified the dessert's preparation, and the introduction of vanilla wafers by the National Biscuit Company in 1898. Contrary to popular belief, the dessert had already been popular before vanilla wafers had become intertwined with its identity. The ingenuity of individual cooks that first married vanilla wafers with banana pudding, most notably Miss Laura Curlin's 1921 recipe included in the Bloomington, Illinois Pantograph. Nabisco seized upon this culinary popularity and initiated a marketing strategy to promote banana pudding recipes on their vanilla wafers boxes by the 1940s. The exact origins of banana pudding being Southern are hard to trace because early recipes were based in Massachusetts and Illinois. In 1933, a syndicated column offered a recipe for Southern banana pudding. Though it didn't explain what made it Southern, it was a layered sponge cake and custard variety of pudding, although it had an odd twist that we hadn't seen in other recipes. The banana slices were fried before they were layered into the pan. But after World War II, banana pudding's Southern identity really took hold. By the 1950s, newspaper writers were routinely associating the dessert being Southern. In 1956, for instance, the New York Age headline declared Deep South banana pudding tasty treat. And in 1959, Oregon Statesman noted that banana pudding has a touch of the South. Significantly, this period also saw African American cooks who continuously played an essential role in shaping Southern cuisine, adopting and enhancing banana pudding by integrating ripe bananas, custards, and vanilla wafers, and leveraging their culinary prowess. African American cooks would not only embrace but enrich banana pudding and infuse it into the collective identity of African Americans that spanned generations. Aided by the Second Great Migration, saw African Americans move from the South across the United States, most notably the West, bringing with them their cultural and culinary traditions. Among these was banana pudding, a dish that quickly found a place as a symbol of home and comfort among the African American community during a time of significant displacement. Amid the economic constraints and the collective struggle of civil rights during the 1960s, this dessert became a staple of family gatherings, church events. During the shared meals, it became a central of communal cohesion and activism. Banana pudding, with its simple yet nutritious ingredients, embodied the creativity and resilience of African American culinary heritage. As the later half of the 20th century began to unfold, banana pudding had undisputably cemented itself into Southern African American culture and family celebrations. It could represent much more than a dish. It was a testament to African American culinary traditions. And as the culinary world evolves, so does the approach to classic dishes. The tradition of banana pudding continues to be cherished, and while it simultaneously has undergone a renaissance at the hand of contemporary Black chefs, these culinary artists are remixing this classic dessert with innovative techniques and bold new flavors, reflecting the evolving taste and the global influence of Black chefs on today's palate. While the essence of banana pudding as a culinary touchstone remains the same, its ongoing evolution speaks to the dynamic nature of Black chefs. Originally, this treat was very simple with some basic ingredients like vanilla custard, ripe bananas, and vanilla wafers. These creative chefs were mixing flavors from all over the world to make it even more delicious. For example, some add caramel to add an unexpected savory kick, or mangoes for a tropical vibe. There is also a thought to the more health conscious, creating versions for people who are vegan or need to avoid gluten. Banana pudding has become a dessert that everybody can become excited about. This inclusive approach is a part of the bigger picture where modern cooking is more about making sure everyone can enjoy great food no matter their dietary needs. The legacy of banana pudding and its transformation is a perfect example of how Black culture has enriched American cuisine. African Americans did not create banana pudding. We didn't even introduce banana pudding to America. We adopted and we made it better while simultaneously absorbing it into African American culture. And as banana pudding keeps evolving, as does the delicious reminder of African Americans' contribution to America's culinary landscape, proving that even the simplest dishes can have a deep, meaningful impact. Nearly 7,000 years ago, in what is now Mexico, corn started as wild grass before evolving into one of the world's staple crops. This journey into domestication started around 1200 BCE. It was pivotal in the rise of civilizations across the Americas. It saw indigenous tribes meticulously cultivate various strains of this versatile plant. This helped corn flourish in diverse climates from Illinois to Mexico. Maize became integral not only as a staple, but also as a cornerstone of cultural identity among indigenous populations. This was notably recognized in the cultivation practices of the Three Sisters, which is maize, winter squash, and climbing beans, a farming approach that showcased this agricultural tradition. The indigenous peoples' innovations extended to culinary uses, transforming maize into cornmeal, which would become the foundation of a myriad of dishes, including an early version of cornbread. When European settlers arrived in the late 1500s, early 16th century, the settlers encountered a crop that was versatile and adaptable to the challenging conditions in the New World. This crucial introduction led cornmeal's prominence as a staple of settlers' diet, who developed their own version of cornbread, which was primarily cornmeal, water, salt. This differed a bit from the indigenous recipes. During the early days, the southern United States cultivated a prolific amount of corn since corn could be grown relatively easily and didn't cost as much as wheat. Cornbread became essential food, unlike in the mid-Atlantic colonies where wheat could be grown successfully. In the South, wheat was scarce and was often exported to Great Britain. This made it a luxury item reserved for special occasions. Instead, cornmeal, which was packed with affordability and nutrients, became the staple of Southern households. This set up perfectly for cornbread to evolve, especially when Southern cooks began to add buttermilk, eggs, baking powder to their recipes, making it moist and a slightly sweet dish. Furthermore, cornbread played a crucial role in the Revolutionary War, not just for its nutritional value, but for its convenience. It could be easily carried and was perfect for feeding troops on the move. Families back home were continuously enhancing the cornbread recipe by adding ingredients like molasses, butter, and milk to improve the flavor. It was common to bake cornbread loaves, shape them into patties that were fried, leading to the creation of hoe cakes and Johnny cakes. For enslaved Black folks, daily rations were scarce, mostly constituting corn, leftover greens, animal parts, and molasses. Out of necessity and ingenuity, they developed various ways to incorporate cornmeal into the food preparation, often drawing inspiration from their Native American neighbors' culinary practices. The process entailed creating dough from cornmeal and water, wrapping it in collard leaves, and baking it on hot ashes. These traditional techniques gave birth to foods that we know now as hoe cake, ash cakes, spoon bread, corn pone, and cornbread. Interestingly enough, the relationship between Africa and the Americans concerning corn predates the settlers' arrival. Historical accounts suggest that as early as 1493, a year before Columbus' first voyage, the Portuguese played a pivotal role in introducing maize to Africa via the Congo. This rapid adoption spread maize across Central and Western Africa within 50 years, underscoring the crop's adaptability and importance. By the time of Giovanni Ramunzo's note of an ear of corn in his writings in 1554, it had already become a staple in those regions, marking its significance in this transatlantic cultural exchange. Therefore, the first enslaved Africans who were forcibly brought to America in 1619 encountered a very familiar ally in corn in the alien landscape of the New World. Although cornbread was an ingenious invention born out of the need to stretch limited rations, it also stands as a poignant reminder of the cruelties forced upon those in bondage. Many enslaved people were only allowed a minimal amount of time to eat, prepare meals, causing a heavy reliance on foods like cornbread that could be consumed without utensils and was easily transportable and had a good shelf life, making it ideal for working within the fields. As different variations of cornbread became a staple for the enslaved, recipes eventually made their way from the plantation into the big house and the cookbooks of the elite. While some of these adaptations employed similar methods to ash cake preparation, they were often enhanced with richer ingredients such as milk and butter. James Monroe family, for example, recorded recipes for egg, bread, and spoon bread, and even George Washington reportedly had a penchant for hoe cakes drizzled in honey and butter. During the Civil War, similar to the Revolutionary War, cornbread morphed into a derivative version called corn tack, a staple of both Union and Confederate soldiers, made out of simply cornmeal and water. Corn tack was a product of frugality and necessity and often cooked on open fire, mirroring the exact same methods used by enslaved Black people. Despite its lack of taste and its subpar texture, it was documented in countless soldier accounts and served its purpose of sustaining life during difficult times. In the later part of the 19th century and into the early 20th century, African American communities began to move northward, carrying their rich culinary traditions with them. This period was also marked with the transformation of cornbread. Faced with new ingredients and influenced by cultural and social evolutions, African Americans innovated and expanded on their traditional cornbread into new forms such as corn pone, griddle cakes, corn muffin, hoe cakes, and hush puppies. The story of hush puppies is really interesting in particular because it's rumored to be used by escaping slaves to quiet dogs. However, the earliest mention of hush puppies appears to be much, much later. Indeed, there were similar dishes to hush puppies as early as 1840. However, it seems that they were called red horse bread. This dish wasn't referred to as hush puppies at least until after emancipation. Cornbread continued to be a staple for many families during the Great Depression because of its affordability and its simplicity. Made with minimal ingredients like cornmeal and water, it was a symbol of the resourcefulness of white and black households and often was paired with greens or whatever could be harvested from family gardens. This basic rendition, known as hot water cornbread, shown its ability to create substance from very little. As America recovered and society overall became much wealthier, ingredients that were previously considered luxuries like eggs and buttermilk became commonplace. This shift allowed cornbread to transform into a much richer, cake-like variation of its former self, changing with the time to reflect the improved living standards with refrigeration or other advancement that facilitate the evolution even further, making cornbread more accessible and versatile. Skillet cornbread, cooked in cast iron skillets, was passed down from generation to generation, and it's a testament to the continued heritage between African American communities. These pans would not only cook the bread, but they carried stories and memories and embedded a sense of family and tradition in each bite of cornbread. This version of cornbread was richer and tender due to the addition of buttermilk and is the cornerstone of Southern cooking and African American culinary traditions. The introduction of Jiffy cornbread mix during the mid-20th century marked another significant milestone. This convenience item allowed families to enjoy cornbread with minimal preparation time. It gained quick adoption, especially during periods of great social change like the Second Great Migration, when African Americans were moving into cities in the West and the Midwest. Jiffy brought the taste of home and comfort during times of great upheaval. The story of cornbread is not just about the ingredients or preparation. It is a deeply tied discussion of health, socioeconomic status, and cultural identity within the Black community. The legacy of cornbread is a part of soul food traditions and brings up debates about how to balance cultural heritage with the need for healthier adaptations. This conversation reflects the broader change within Black communities, including the accessibility of healthier options and the disproportionate impacts of health-related disease on the Black community. Throughout its history, cornbread has been more than just a food. It symbolizes resilience and expresses cultural identity and serves as a unifying centerpiece for gatherings, whether it was sweetened or unsweetened, made the old-fashioned way, or using modern conveniences. Cornbread embodies the dynamic nature of the Black community's culinary traditions and are constantly evolving while remaining rooted in its rich history. Today, cornbread still remains significant. Cornbread is often served with black-eyed peas and greens during New Year's Day celebrations and Juneteenth celebrations, bridging the past and present and celebrating the enduring spirit of rich African-American traditions. Every slice of cornbread carries a story of struggle, perseverance, and community. Domesticated in Western Africa around 3000 BC, the birthplace of this legume known as the black-eyed pea, the lush valleys and rural villages near the Lake Chad Basin in what is now Nigeria and northern Cameroon, these early Western African civilizations, black-eyed pea was more than a crop. It was a crucial part of daily life and culture, revered and cherished by the people who cultivated it. Black-eyed peas is a shaling bean, a subspecies of the cowpea. It's a type of bean enclosed in a long green pod. And despite the harsh environmental conditions where it grew, black-eyed peas flourished. It became a staple of their diet and provided them with much-needed nourishment as it began to spread across the globe. During communal feasts, traditional ceremonies, black-eyed peas took center stage. Lively celebrations with family and friends gathered around, the air rich with the aroma of akara, which is a savory fritter made from black-eyed peas. Each bite is a testament to a shared heritage. This simple legume was woven into the very fabric of life while in Western Africa. black-eyed peas don't have this folkloric connection to money, were often associated with good luck. One belief held the distinction that the pea could ward off the evil eye, a malevolent spell cast by one's enemies. They were also eaten during special occasions. Take Good Friday, for instance. Families in parts of Western Africa would traditionally enjoy a creamy cowpea coconut custard dish called a frijan. In some Western African religions, black-eyed peas are prepared as offerings to deities on ceremonial days because it's believed to be their favorite food. However, this story takes a dark turn. During the transatlantic slave trade, Africans were torn from their homeland. Enslaved Africans were forced onto ships, but they held on to their cultural roots as tightly as they could. Among those roots was the black-eyed pea. Upon arriving in plantations in the American South, the enslaved Africans planted the pea in unfamiliar soil, seeking a connection to their lost heritage. Those peas, much like the enslaved Africans, were resilient. They flourished in rugged conditions and became a crucial part of their diet. Boiled, mashed, and tossed in stews, black-eyed peas provided essential nutrients that helped them sustain through their grueling labor. Soon, black-eyed peas became a significant part of Southern culture. Embraced by enslaved people, it was eventually adopted by their white enslavers. It became known as the poor man's meat due to its nutritious qualities. The resilience of these little legumes symbolized the endurance and adaptability of the people who depended on them. But this doesn't explain how black-eyed peas came to be associated with New Year's Day. The tradition of eating black-eyed peas on New Year's Day is steeped in history and some cultural lore. It all began ironically in Western Europe, where New Year's Day customs included a practice known as first footing. According to Ralph Whitlock's book, The Search for Lost Gods, A Guide to British Folklore, the first person to step within the threshold of a home on New Year's Day morning needed to be dark-haired, which is believed to bring good luck. Often the person would bring gifts of coal and bread, which symbolized the wish for the house to be abundant in fuel and food throughout the coming year. People believed that whatever happened on the first day, good or bad, would set the tone for the rest of the year. Over time, the tradition evolved, especially in the American South. Instead of requiring a dark-haired stranger to knock on the door, people began to place black-eyed peas on their table. Enslaved Africans blended their own cultural beliefs with those of European settlers, influencing this change because black-eyed peas was already considered lucky in Western Africa. But there's also a story behind how black-eyed peas began to symbolize luck in the southern United States, and it's linked to the Civil War, specifically Sherman's March to the Sea in 1864. Major William Tecumseh Sherman led a brutal campaign from Atlanta to Savannah, determined to cripple the Confederate war effort. His troops left a path of destruction, stripping households of food supplies and livestock. As Southern families emerged from hiding, they faced the grim reality of starvation. In this despair, a particular form of salvation emerged. Union troops, deeming black-eyed peas only fit for livestock, left silos of them behind. This forgotten pea provided crucial nourishment for numerous Southerners, providing a vital food source in the aftermath of Sherman's scorched earth strategy. This fortunate discovery led to a new tradition, along with that of enslaved Africans, of eating black-eyed peas on New Year in the hopes of garnering good luck for the coming year. After the Civil War, freed African Americans faced the monumental task of rebuilding their lives. Despite oppression, they found strength in the shared culinary practices, with black-eyed peas continuing to play a central role. Beyond the historical context, black-eyed peas also hold a special place in culinary traditions because they resemble coins. These peas were believed to bring monetary prosperity when consumed during New Year's celebrations. This belief, rooted in African customs, was passed down through generations and blended with Southern culinary practices. The legacy of these traditions continues in dishes like Hoppin' John, which typically features black-eyed peas cooked with rice, pork, and spices. This is a dish that melds African cooking techniques along with Southern ingredients, symbolizing a blend of old and new worlds and reminding us of perseverance of those who came before us. Later, during the Great Migration, when millions of African Americans moved from the South to urban areas in the North, they once again took those culinary traditions with them. The black-eyed pea found its way into kitchens, Harlem, Chicago, and Detroit, symbolizing a peaceful home and a source of comfort in this unfamiliar environment. In contemporary times, black-eyed peas are celebrated not just for their traditional role, but for their nutritional value. They have become a favorite ingredient in various dishes, from soul food to modern culinary experiments, illustrating the adaptability and enduring relevance of the humble legume. Today, preparing a pot of black-eyed peas is an act of cultural preservation and celebration. It connects generations. It allows people to recall the past and create new memories, whether it enjoyed doing family gatherings, community events, or quiet dinners. The humble black-eyed pea continues to tell a story of resilience, perseverance, and a shared heritage. In the culinary world, the debate over steak doneness is almost as intense as the marbling in the beef itself. For decades, chefs and critics and celebrities have passionately defended their favorite level of doneness, drawing from their unique tapestry of personal experiences. Some critics can barely contain their disdain for well-done steaks, often comparing it to the highest of culinary offenses. The late Anthony Bourdain wrote in his memoirs that diners who ask for a well-done steak are answered with fillets that have been spit on. Yet, let's not be too quick to pass judgment. The preference for a well-done steak is not a culinary crime. In fact, many people genuinely savor the leather-like texture and flavor throughout a well-cooked steak. Ultimately, though, restaurants should embrace the diverse tastes from rare aficionados to well-done devotees. So this brings us to how Black folks became associated with well-done steaks. Let's journey back to the dawn of human civilization, where cooking meats was as primal as the crackling fire that they roasted over. Early humans gathered around communal fires, focusing on making their food choices both edible and safe to eat. Cooking their food simply allowed for better digestion, with little room for luxuries such as flavor or texture. But as societies advanced, so did their culinary ambitions. Controlled by cooking methods like ovens and grills, this led to the realization that temperatures of doneness could bring out unique flavors and textures. So let's fast forward to the Renaissance, when the culinary arts blossomed across Europe. In the kitchens of France and England, chefs were honing their culinary craft and experimenting with flavors and textures. Although specific historical records do not pin down the exact moment the term doneness popped up into our lexicon, it's believed that variations of this term have been swirling around since at least 1150. By the 17th century, cookbooks began to provide detailed instructions on how to prepare meat, allowing diners to request their preferred level of doneness using terms like rare, medium, medium well, and well done. Prior to these terms, people simply would have used terms like underdone or undercooked. In the early days of the Americas, steak was a practical food source for settlers and pioneers. The abundance of cattle in the New World made it a favorite protein. Cooking methods were basic, often involving open flames and very rudimentary grills. The concept of steak doneness had yet to be formalized. Meat was typically cooked thoroughly to mitigate health risks. As America moved into the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution brought together significant advancements in food production and preparation. Improved cooking appliances and temperature control methods allow for more precision in cooking meat. Steakhouses began to emerge in urban centers like Chicago and New York, catering to the growing middle to upper class who sought a fine dining experience. During this time, the concept of steak doneness, ranging from rare to to medium to take shape, influencing both culinary trends and customer preferences. In the post-World War II era, it marked another pivotal moment in the history of steak doneness in America. Urbanization and the rise of the backyard barbecue culture popularized grilling as a social activity. Americans began to experiment with different levels of steak doneness, leading to regional preferences. For instance, the Midwest developed a reputation for favoring their steaks medium to medium well, while the coastal areas leaned towards a rarer preparation. However, the preference for well-done steaks remained ingrained for many Americans. Well-done steaks were still considered the norm in many households, reflecting a mix of traditions and personal tastes. For a significant portion of the population, well-done steaks symbolized a sense of familiarity and comfort rooted in generational cooking practices. However, for Black Americans, this epic tale of steak doneness begins in the smoke-filled kitchens of southern plantations. Enslaved African Americans often found themselves relegated to the kitchen scraps and the grisly, seemingly unedible parts of the animals that were often discarded. Faced with tough, stewy cuts of meat, they rose to the challenge, wielding slow cooking as their magic wand. As smoky aromas filled the air, these forgotten pieces were transformed into tender, flavorful dishes, elevated by the infusion of herbs, spices, and a lot of love. The culinary practices among Black Americans have deep roots in African traditions, adapted and evolved throughout the harsh realities of enslavement. Enslaved Africans brought these traditions with them to the Americas and then infused them with Southern cuisine. Forced to make do with lesser cuts of meat, they turned to slow cooking methods such as barbecuing and braising. These techniques brilliantly turn necessity into culinary innovation by rendering tougher cuts of meat tender and delicious. Over time, this tradition of well-cooked meats, including steak, became a hallmark of Black kitchens. This preference likely evolved due to a mix of necessity and cultural adaptation. By cooking tougher cuts of meat for extended periods of time, the meat was transformed into something edible. Safety concerns also played a role during this time when foodborne illnesses were rampant and medical care was extremely limited. Thoroughly cooked meat, especially pork and poultry, was the only option. Safety measures further cemented the tradition of well-cooked meat in Black culinary practices. Following emancipation, the culinary story took a new turn. Waves of African Americans surged from the rural South into bustling metropolis in the North and the West during the Great Migration. This mass movement spurred significant culinary exchange and adaptation, access to a wider variety of foods, including better cuts of meat, providing opportunities for experimentation with different cooking methods and levels of doneness, leading to an evolution that established traditions while paying homage to their roots. Yet, well-cooked meat remained the norm. During the Jim Crow era, African Americans endured relentless systemic, economic, and social inequities that permeated every aspect of their life. Far beyond separate drinking fountains and separate schools, this was a time where economic exploitation wove itself into the daily fabric of Black existence and manifested even in seemingly the simple act of purchasing food. Imagine walking into a grocery store where the shelves were sparse, produce was bruised, and the meat was past expiration. There were tales of butchers fully aware of the limited options that were available to Black shoppers who shamelessly offloaded their nearly expired meat. Black families were then forced to cook that meat thoroughly to ensure that it was safe to eat. This was not just a matter of poor business practices, but a daily reminder of the systemic barriers deliberately designed to demean and exploit. These butchers and shop owners were just one cog in a larger machine of Jim Crow exploitation. Black communities during this time had extremely limited access to mainstream markets or resources. As a result, they often relied on local businesses within their own communities. Businesses themselves were entangled in a system intent on keeping Black people economically disadvantaged. The economic struggles of these small businesses made it difficult for them to then provide high-quality goods, further entrenching this cycle of exploitation. In this harsh reality, it is very plausible that butchers and other food suppliers took advantage of Black customers by selling them low-quality, nearly expired products. Such practices would fit seamlessly into the broader patterns of discrimination and economic exploitation that defined the era. While direct documentation of butchers specifically selling expired meats to Black customers is sparse, the collective memory, personal narratives, community accounts handed down through generations paint a compelling picture of these injustices. By the mid-20th century, an unstoppable wave swept through America, irrevocably changing the fabric of society. The civil rights movement not only fought for justice, but it also ignited a vibrant sense of pride and connection within the African American community. This new vigor infused every part of life, especially in the kitchen, where African American chefs and cooks began to receive recognition that they so long deserved. Their culinary talents illuminated the rich and diverse culinary heritage that had long been overlooked. Amidst this culinary tapestry, one tradition unfurled like a banner, and this was a preference for well-done steaks. Today, across America, choices about how to cook steak reflect more than just personal preferences. And as we stated, they are intertwined with traditions and family histories. And while many cherish their steaks well done as a preference rooted in earlier generations and often linked to safety concerns and cooking methods passed down from families, in the broader landscape of the American steak preferences, we find that the variety of doneness levels tell their own stories. Statistics show that medium rare is the most popular doneness, with about 38% steak enthusiasts worldwide preferring this level of doneness. 32% of Americans prefer a medium steak. Other preferences like rare and medium well each garner around 12% of the population, while a well-done steak is chosen about 6% of the time. However, within the African American community, a unique pattern emerges around the medium well steaks at 37%, a preference that is a bit different from the overall trend. Then, close behind that is medium and well-done steaks, who are also popular in the African American community at 28 and 25% respectively. So it seems that African Americans still have a very high preference for well-done steak. But before I leave you today, we're going to leave you with one last note. Renowned food writer and historian Jessica B. Harris captured the sentiment about Black people and their steak doneness perfectly. The African American table is one that is rooted in the legacy of survival, adaptation, and ultimately resilience. Thank you. This has been One Mic Black History. I'm your host, Country Boy. If you love stories like this, you can find more stories like this at onemichistory.com. I'd like to thank all my subscribers. Without you, none of this could be possible. And I love you. Peace.